On June 25, 1950, the silence of dawn in Korea was shattered by tanks and gunfire. Thousands of soldiers poured across the 38th parallel. Villages that had been quiet hours before were burning. Families ran for their lives. In an instant, the Cold War was no longer a distant threat. It was here, and America was being pulled in. This was the Korean War, a war where American soldiers fought in heat and snow, where battles were won and lost by inches, and where the very future of Asia hung in the balance. And yet, most people today barely remember it. Why was this war forgotten? And how did America's struggle in Korea shape the world we live in now? This is the story of America's forgotten war. Korea, 1950 to 1953. But before we begin, welcome to Mission America. This is the channel where we bring history to life. The wars, the struggles, and the turning points that built this nation. If you love stories told straight, with no sugarcoating, make sure to subscribe now, because you don't want to miss this journey. The Korean Peninsula, 1950. A land of mountains, rivers, and rice paddies. Villages dotted the countryside, and cities bustled with post-war recovery. On the surface, life seemed calm, but underneath, a storm was gathering. For 35 years, Korea had been under Japanese occupation. The end of World War II brought liberation, but also division. The Allies split Korea along the 38th parallel, the Soviet Union in the north, the United States in the south. The line seemed temporary, but it planted the seeds of conflict. In the north, Kim Il-sung, a young, ambitious communist trained and supported by the Soviets, began building a military force capable of taking the south. In the south, Syngman Rhee, a staunch anti-communist, formed a government with American support. Each leader claimed the right to unify the peninsula under their rule. Both were willing to use force, and both were impatient. Tensions rose. Border clashes were common. Civilians often became casualties in these skirmishes, their homes destroyed, their lives uprooted. Yet much of the world paid little attention. Europe was rebuilding, the Cold War had just begun, and Korea seemed far away. In the months leading up to June 1950, South Korean forces faced raids and attacks from the north. North Korean soldiers conducted surprise assaults across the border. Small towns were destroyed, families fled, bridges and roads became chaotic escape routes. The North Koreans were preparing for something bigger, a full-scale invasion. At dawn, North Korean tanks and artillery thundered across the 38th parallel. 75,000 troops advanced south in a coordinated strike. South Korean defenses, ill-equipped and undertrained, crumbled quickly. Cities fell in hours. Civilians fled in panic, carrying what little they could save. Roads and bridges were clogged with soldiers and refugees. Entire towns were burned, either deliberately or by accident in the chaos. The invasion was swift and brutal. It sent shockwaves across the peninsula and across the Pacific. In Washington, the U.S. government reacted with alarm. Korea was distant, and few Americans understood its strategic importance. But President Harry Truman did. He saw the invasion not as a local conflict, but as a test of America's resolve in the emerging Cold War. The question was stark. Could the U.S. allow communism to expand unchecked, or would it intervene? Truman took the crisis to the United Nations, seeking international backing. To America's advantage, the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN at the time, protesting the exclusion of China's seat. That absence allowed the UN to pass a resolution authorizing military action to repel North Korean aggression. America would lead a coalition, though initially it was mostly American troops. The first U.S. soldiers to arrive were part of Task Force Smith. Their mission? Delay the North Koreans and buy time for reinforcements. But they were under-equipped and unprepared for the scale of the North Korean attack. At Osan, South Korea, the Americans faced Soviet-made T-34 tanks. Their weapons jammed. Their artillery was ineffective. Within hours, the force was overwhelmed. Dozens were killed, many captured. It was a harsh lesson. Korea would not be easy. Civilians were caught in the middle. Families fled south, sometimes on foot for days, carrying children and possessions. Villages became battlegrounds. Food and medical supplies were scarce. Refugees faced hunger, disease, and the constant threat of violence. Soldiers also faced extreme challenges. They were inexperienced, undertrained, and facing an enemy well-armed and determined. Fear and exhaustion were constant companions. The Korean War was not just a local conflict. It was the first battle of the Cold War. The U.S. feared that if North Korea succeeded, neighboring countries might fall to communism. The domino effect could destabilize all of Asia. China and the Soviet Union watched carefully, ready to intervene if America pushed too far. Truman's decisions would set precedents for how the U.S. would fight communism for decades. Could a small, underprepared American force slow the North Korean advance? How would civilians survive as cities burned and roads jammed with refugees? Would the United States act decisively, or would Korea fall entirely under communist control? And most importantly, how far would America be willing to go to defend democracy in a distant land? These questions would soon be answered in fire, courage, and sacrifice on the battlefields of Korea. The invasion of South Korea in June 1950 shocked the world. Cities burned, civilians fled, and yet, across the Pacific, most Americans barely knew where Korea was. For President Harry Truman, ignorance was not an option. The stakes were clear. If North Korea succeeded, communism could spread unchecked across Asia, threatening allies and global stability. Truman faced a momentous decision: intervene or risk the fall of Korea. Truman moved quickly. The United States called for a United Nations resolution to repel the invasion. To America's advantage, the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN, protesting China's absence. The resolution passed, allowing the United States to lead a coalition to aid South Korea. But the reality on the ground was stark. U.S. forces had been reduced dramatically after World War II. Soldiers were inexperienced, equipment was outdated, and time was running out. The first American troops to face the North Koreans were part of Task Force Smith, a small contingent sent to delay the enemy. On July 5, 1950, near the town of Osan, they took positions along a road, hoping to slow the North Korean advance. They had limited artillery, outdated weapons, and almost no anti-tank capability. The enemy came with tanks, artillery, and thousands of soldiers. Task Force Smith fought bravely, but their weapons jammed, and their lines collapsed under the weight of the assault. Within hours, they were overrun. Dozens were killed, and many more captured. It was America's first real test in Korea, and it ended in disaster. While soldiers fought, civilians were caught in chaos. Families fled south, sometimes on foot for days. Roads were clogged with abandoned vehicles, carts carrying livestock, and desperate people. Hospitals overflowed. Food and clean water were scarce. Refugees told stories of villages burned, friends lost, and the constant fear of artillery or gunfire. Children were orphaned. elderly people struggled to keep up. It was a humanitarian nightmare, and one that would continue throughout the war. After the setback at Osan, the United States began pouring troops and equipment into South Korea. Soldiers arrived from Japan, bringing tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Commanders began reorganizing defenses to hold the line at the Pusan Perimeter, a small corner of southeastern Korea. General Walton Walker, commanding U.S. 8th Army, issued a simple order: stand or die. There was no room for retreat. If the perimeter failed, the entire peninsula would fall. American troops were inexperienced but determined. They learned quickly. Night attacks, ambushes, and enemy infiltration were deadly threats. Small units were often cut off, forcing soldiers to improvise, fight fiercely, and survive against overwhelming odds. Each battle raised questions that haunted commanders and soldiers alike. Could a small force hold back a much larger enemy? Would reinforcements arrive in time? How long could civilians survive under bombardment? The answers would come slowly, often at a terrible cost. America's involvement in Korea was about more than one country. It was the first real test of the containment policy against communism. Truman and his advisors understood that failure here could embolden the Soviet Union and China, encouraging further communist expansion across Asia. Every decision, sending reinforcements, choosing defensive positions, committing air power, was made under immense pressure. Lives and reputations hung in the balance. Despite early setbacks, U.S. and South Korean forces held the line at Pusan, but holding a shrinking perimeter against a relentless enemy was only the beginning. Soon, America would have to act boldly. A risky plan, daring in scale and dangerous in execution, would be proposed, one that could turn the entire war upside down. Could American forces succeed against impossible odds? Could Korea be saved, or was defeat inevitable? The answers would come at the Pusan Perimeter, the desperate last stand before the tide of war could be turned. By August 1950, the North Korean army had pushed deep into South Korea. Cities fell one after another. The South Korean army was in retreat. Civilians fled in panic, carrying children, livestock, and what little they could save. Refugee columns stretched for miles along roads clogged with abandoned vehicles and debris. In the southeast corner of the peninsula, only one small area remained under control: the Pusan Perimeter, a narrow strip of land around the port city of Pusan. If it fell, the entire country would be lost. American General Walton Walker and his South Korean counterparts faced an almost impossible task. They were outnumbered. Many soldiers were inexperienced, tired, and poorly supplied. But there was no choice. Hold the line at all costs. The Pusan Perimeter became the front line of the Korean War. Every ridge, river, and road was fortified. Soldiers dug trenches under scorching heat or freezing wind in the mountains. They camouflaged positions, planted mines, and dug foxholes to survive incoming fire. North Korean troops attacked relentlessly. Soviet-built T-34 tanks smashed through forward positions. Infantry units stormed hills and roads with fierce determination. Artillery fire rained down. Casualties mounted on both sides. American and South Korean soldiers were often forced to fight in small units, separated by terrain or retreating forces. Communication was difficult. Supply lines were overextended, morale fluctuated between hope and despair. A single ridge could change hands multiple times in a day. Villages became fortified zones. Bridges were blown and rebuilt. Every inch of land became a battleground. Private James Thompson, a young American soldier, recalled the relentless pressure. "We fought for days without sleep. We dug trenches in the dirt under artillery fire and held them with nothing but rifles and determination. Every time the enemy charged, we thought this might be the end. But we kept fighting because, if we fell, Korea would be lost." Meanwhile, South Korean soldiers and civilians worked together to evacuate refugees. Families walked for days through mountains and rivers, carrying children, food, and blankets. The suffering was immense, but the human spirit persevered. Slowly, reinforcements arrived from Japan. Fresh American soldiers, tanks, artillery, and planes strengthened the Pusan Perimeter. Commanders reorganized defensive lines. Supply chains improved. Despite these reinforcements, tension remained. Every day, commanders asked themselves, could the perimeter hold against another massive North Korean push? Would civilians survive if the line broke? And could America use this position to strike back, or were they doomed to a defensive war? The psychological strain on soldiers was extreme. Many had already experienced brutal combat at Osan or in retreat. Now they faced constant bombardment, ambushes, and night attacks. Sleep was rare, fear was constant. Soldiers witnessed comrades killed or wounded in ways that haunted them for life. Yet, the will to survive and defend Korea was unbroken. Every soldier understood the stakes. If the Pusan Perimeter fell, all of South Korea might be lost. Despite intense pressure, the Pusan Perimeter held. Against overwhelming odds, American and South Korean forces stabilized the front line. But a bold, risky plan was brewing. General Douglas MacArthur proposed an amphibious landing far behind enemy lines, an operation that seemed nearly impossible. The target? Inchon, a port city guarded by tides, mudflats, and enemy forces. The question that would define the next chapter: could America pull off a near-impossible victory and turn the tide of war? Or would this daring gamble end in disaster? By September 1950, American and South Korean forces were finally holding their ground at the Pusan Perimeter. They had stopped the North Korean advance, but the war was far from over. For every mile gained, the North Koreans still held the initiative. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of U.S. forces in Korea, realized that a bold, decisive strike was necessary, something audacious enough to surprise the enemy and change the course of the war. MacArthur proposed landing behind North Korean lines at Inchon, a port city near Seoul. The plan was considered nearly impossible. Inchon's tides were extreme, rising and falling up to 30 feet daily. Landing craft could easily be stranded on mudflats. Narrow channels limited maneuverability. Enemy forces guarded the city, ready to repel any attack. Advisors warned him, "It's too risky. The enemy will destroy our troops." But MacArthur saw the opportunity. Because the landing seemed impossible, the North Koreans would not expect it. Surprise was the key. Weeks of preparation followed. U.S. Navy ships rehearsed landings, Marines trained for urban combat, and intelligence teams studied tides, mudflats, and enemy positions. Every detail mattered. Soldiers knew the risks. Private William Harris recalled, "We were told Inchon was near impossible. The tides, the mud, the enemy, all of it. But we also knew this could change everything. There was fear, yes, but also determination. If we failed, Korea might be lost." At dawn, the U.S. forces advanced. Naval guns roared, bombarding enemy positions. Helicopters and planes circled overhead, providing cover. Landing craft surged through narrow channels, guided by tides and intelligence. The North Koreans were caught off guard. Their defenses, designed for a frontal assault from the south, were not prepared for an attack from the west. Within hours, American troops had secured the beaches and advanced inland. After securing Inchon, U.S. forces pushed toward Seoul, the South Korean capital. Street by street, house by house, soldiers engaged in intense urban combat. Snipers hid in ruined buildings. Civilians, terrified, fled wherever they could. The fighting was chaotic. Supplies ran low. Commanders had to improvise constantly. Yet the Marines and U.S. Army units pressed forward, motivated by the knowledge that success here could shift the war entirely. Within days, Inchon and Seoul were under Allied control. North Korean forces, surprised and outmaneuvered, began a rapid retreat. The victory was stunning. A small, daring amphibious operation had turned the tide of the war. But MacArthur faced a critical decision. Should U.S. forces stop at the 38th parallel or continue north toward the Yalu River, bordering China? His choice would set the stage for an even greater challenge. Could the North Koreans regroup and counterattack? Was it wise to push toward the Chinese border, or would it provoke a new, even larger war? Could the U.S. maintain momentum, or was this victory temporary? Inchon was a triumph, but the war was far from over. The next challenge, China's entry into the conflict, would test American forces like never before. By late October 1950, American and South Korean forces were advancing deep into North Korea. Seoul had been liberated, Pyongyang had fallen, and U.S. troops were moving toward the Yalu River, the border with China. Victory seemed near. But behind the mountains, China was watching. Mao Zedong, leader of the newly established People's Republic of China, viewed the U.S. advance as a direct threat. Tens of thousands of foreign troops approaching the Chinese border were unacceptable. China made a decisive move. They would intervene. Over 300,000 Chinese volunteer soldiers crossed into North Korea, traveling mostly on foot through harsh terrain to avoid detection. Their mission? Strike behind U.S. lines and push the Americans back. The sudden scale of Chinese involvement shocked the U.S. military. What had seemed like a path to victory was about to become a nightmare. Chinese troops used stealth, night attacks, and massive infantry waves. American soldiers, confident after victories at Inchon and Seoul, were unprepared for the speed and ferocity of the attacks. Private Robert Lee recalled, "They seemed to appear out of nowhere. One night we were on a ridge thinking it was quiet, and suddenly they were charging. We fired everything we had. It was terrifying. I've never seen anything like it." The Americans realized that the war had changed completely. Holding ground was now far more difficult. One of the most brutal engagements occurred at Chosin Reservoir. U.S. Marines found themselves surrounded by tens of thousands of Chinese troops in freezing winter conditions. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Guns jammed, vehicles froze, and frostbite claimed more soldiers than bullets at times. Despite overwhelming odds, the Marines fought with discipline and courage. They conducted a fighting withdrawal, maintaining cohesion while inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy. The retreat became legendary, a tactical miracle that saved thousands of lives. By early 1951, front lines stabilized near the 38th parallel, almost exactly where the war had started. Both sides dug in, creating fortified positions across hills, rivers, and ridges. Artillery, mines, and defensive lines became the defining feature of the battlefield. Each small advance required massive effort. Cities changed hands repeatedly, casualties mounted. The psychological toll was enormous. Soldiers faced constant artillery, ambushes, and freezing winters. Morale fluctuated, but the knowledge that the South could fall if the line broke kept them fighting. Could American forces hold against the larger Chinese army? How far should U.S. troops push north before risking total disaster? Could diplomacy resolve the conflict, or was this now a long-term war of attrition? The answers were uncertain. Each day brought new battles, new heroism, and new losses. Civilians continued to suffer. Families fled repeatedly as front lines shifted. Villages burned. Children were orphaned. Aid was minimal. Yet amid the chaos, acts of courage and resilience emerged. South Korean villagers hiding soldiers, nurses caring for the wounded under fire, and soldiers protecting civilians even while under attack. These personal stories remind us that war is not only about generals and strategies, but also about the lives caught in its path. The entry of China transformed the Korean War. What had seemed like a path to victory now became a grueling stalemate. The next chapter would focus on the stalemate years, the front lines frozen near the 38th parallel, and the grueling battles that defined the last 2 years of the war. Could diplomacy finally end the fighting? Could soldiers survive the harsh winters, relentless artillery, and constant attacks? Would Korea remain divided forever? By early 1951, the Korean War had transformed. The daring victories at Inchon and Seoul had been tempered by China's massive intervention. What had begun as a rapid US-led advance now became a grinding, deadly stalemate. Front lines froze near the 38th parallel, the same line dividing Korea since 1945. Hills, rivers, and ridges became fortified positions, and every small advance required massive effort, planning, and courage. Fighting shifted from dramatic movements to attrition warfare. Artillery barrages were constant. Mines and barbed wire made every step dangerous. Night attacks and ambushes kept soldiers on edge. Private Thomas Jenkins recalled, "It felt like the war would never end. We'd fight all day, dig trenches all night, and sometimes after all that, the enemy would just push us back where we started. You never knew if you'd make it through another day." Soldiers faced harsh weather, from freezing winters to scorching summers. Frostbite, heat stroke, and disease claimed thousands alongside bullets. Supply lines were constantly threatened by guerrilla attacks and artillery strikes. While fighting continued, world leaders began seeking an end to the war. Talks began at Kaesong in 1951, later moving to Panmunjom. Negotiations were slow, tense, and often frustrating. One major sticking point was prisoners of war. Both sides held tens of thousands of captives, and neither wanted to return them all. Arguments over repatriation caused repeated delays, prolonging the conflict. Even as negotiations dragged on, soldiers endured daily battles, artillery exchanges that lasted hours, surprise attacks under the cover of night, skirmishes over small hills or strategic roads. Civilians also suffered. Cities near the front were destroyed, families displaced multiple times, and medical care was scarce. Yet amid the destruction, acts of courage and humanity persisted. Nurses cared for the wounded under fire. Soldiers protected villages. Communities shared food and shelter with refugees. After 2 years of stalemate, a ceasefire agreement was reached on July 27, 1953. The armistice established the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, near the 38th parallel, essentially maintaining the pre-war division. The war was technically over, but no formal peace treaty was signed. North and South Korea remained divided, a separation that continues to this day. The Korean War left a staggering toll. Over 36,000 American soldiers killed, hundreds of thousands wounded, millions of Korean civilians dead, injured, or displaced. For Americans, it became known as the Forgotten War, overshadowed by World War II before it, and Vietnam afterward. Despite the enormous human cost, America's involvement had long-lasting effects. Containment of communism. The U.S. commitment to stopping communist expansion was reinforced. The United Nations' role. The war proved that collective security could act, though imperfectly. South Korea's survival. Democracy survived in the South thanks largely to American intervention. Military lessons. The war taught lessons about logistics, rapid deployment, coalition warfare, and the dangers of underestimating an opponent. 3 years of conflict. Millions of lives changed, and yet much of the world forgot Korea. But history matters. Every battle, every choice, every act of courage shaped the present. Could Korea have been unified peacefully, or was division inevitable? Was the human cost worth the geopolitical gain? How does the Korean War influence global politics today? Private Robert Jenkins summed it up. We fought in heat and snow, in mud and mountains. We didn't know if anyone would remember. But we knew we had to hold the line, for the people of Korea and for the world watching. The Korean War may be called America's forgotten war, but its lessons endure. Courage, sacrifice, and the consequences of global strategy are etched into the mountains, rivers, and cities of Korea. This is Mission America. Subscribe to explore more untold stories of battles and turning points that shaped the United States. And tell us in the comments, if you were there on those frozen hills or in the burning cities, what would you have done?